All right, good evening. Today we're going to be learning Maseches Bava Metzia, Yud Amid Beis and Yud Aleph, and we're going to head to the top of Yud Beis Amid Aleph and finally be caught up since the beginning of the Masechta. So we have a lot of ground to cover. The first Amud and a half is pretty easy. The second Amud and a half is less so, but really beautiful Gemaras to learn. So I'm very excited. Let us jump right in. We're on the bottom of Yud Amid Aleph at a new Mishnah. Ro'as HaMetzia v'nafal aleh. You're a diver. You see an item and you don't even waste any time. You lunge and you land on top of the item. But some sneaky little guy got his hands in and took the football out from under you. It's nice that you jumped on it, but that's not considered a kinyan. The guy who actually picked it up, he wins the victory. And he is then the owner of that item. Says the Gemara at the bottom of Yud Amud Aleph, Amar Reish Lakish, Mishum Abba Kohen Bardula. Arba Amos Shel Adam Konos La B'chol Makom. We have a din, and we've learned this elsewhere in Shas, that anything that's within my Dalet Amos is mine. So kind of implied as to what's going on in the Mishnah is, why did I have to dive on anything? Why did I have to pick anything up? If Arba Amos is Konos La B'chol Makom, so then Arba Amos is Konos La B'chol Makom. What's the big deal? Says, what? So we won't directly get to that, but we'll see a remez to that possibility. And if in fact there's a tie, we have to figure it out. But that's not what?
Tie goes to the running.
Tie, no, not in this case. I think tie here would mean yachloku. That would be shnai mochsim betalas l'chora. That would probably be our Mishnah. Probably be yachloku. So my taima, what is the underpinning of this principle that arba amos shel adam konos b'chol makom? What is the reason behind it? Takinu rabbanon delo asila insuye. The Chachamim instituted this. This doesn't work midoraisa. Really, midoraisa, you have to pick it up, you have to do something. But the Chachamim instituted a policy that in order to make sure people fight less, we therefore assume in halacha that arba amos shel adam konos b'chol makom. Amar Abaye Mosiv Reb Chia Bar Yosef Peah. Abaye says that Reb Chia Bar Yosef asks a kasha on this principle from the world of Peah, and Amar Rava says that Mosiv Reb Yaakov Bar Idi Nezikin. And one person asks from the world of Peah, the other person asks from the world of Nezikin. And now we're going to see what both of them ask, and we're 8 lines from the bottom on Yud Amud Aleph, and the Gemara says as follows: Amar Abaye Mosiv Reb Chia Bar Yosef Peah. What do we learn about the world of Peah? Nata mixas Peah v'zara kala she'ar. Let's say that I take a couple pieces of Peah. I'm an ani. I go into your field and I see that there is there's some Peah there. I pick it up and I throw it onto a pile of other stuff that is also Peah, with the hopes of trying to chaperayim and get all of it. Ein lo baklum. You're 0 for 2. Not only do you not get the Peah that you took, but you also lose out on the Peah that you tried to take. Nafalo aleha, if in fact he fell on top of it, paras taliso aleha, he laid a blanket out on top of the peah, ma'avirin oso hemena, he loses everything yet again. We're not getting into the details of this now, but that is the din of the Mishnah from Maseches peah. V'chein be'omer shikha, and this is also true with a pile of shikha. Now, v'i amris arba amos shaladam konos labachal makom, then niknu le arba amos didei. I don't understand. If Reish Lakish in the name of Abba Kohen Bardala, who's quoted at the open of this Gemara, says that Arba Amos Shel Adam Konos B'chol Makom, if that's true, so then what's with all the jumping? What's with all the throwing? What? Just say you should be able to be konet. It should be that v'im Isa v'i Amres, that Arba Amos Shel Adam Konos B'chol Makom, then Niknu Le Arba Amos Didei. What's the problem? So says the Gemara, in order to answer up from the question on Arba Amos from Peah, we might have thought that there had to be a second criteria, and that is that you have to say Akni, that I'd like to acquire that, and then it's a 2-step formula. If it's within my Dalet Amos, which is about 6 feet, and I say the phrase of Akni, then it works, no problem. Says the Gemara, but that's not the rule. V'i takun Rabbanon kilo amar mayhavek. The Rabbanon made an institution that Arba Amos is konos l'b'chol makom. They didn't say you have to say Akni. They didn't say you have to jump up and down. It's just thought it should be automatic. It's in your Dalet Amos. It's yours. You don't have to say Akni. So says the Gemara, well, maybe not. Because Kevan de Nafal, once we see that this guy is a jumper, right? This guy is jumping on top of the lost item. Gali Daite, what does he reveal about himself when he jumps and doesn't rely on the Chachamim's rule of Dalet Amos? That he wants to acquire by jumping on top of the item, but be'arba amos lo nichale denikni. So here what we're saying is that this guy doesn't want to use the Chachamim's rule of Dalet Amos. Why should that matter? I don't know. But the Gemara says that if a guy says, yes, I know about your Takanas Chachamim, but I'm going to dive on top of it just to be sure, so then the Dalet Amos rule doesn't work. Doesn't work. That's a very interesting halachic gymnastics a little bit. Yes, Dalet Amos works midrabanan, but the midrabanan doesn't work when you jump on top of the item because you're showing that you don't want the Dalet Amos to work. Therefore, it implies that Arba Amos Shel Adam, Konos L'B'chol Makom only works if you want it to, which is a little bit interesting. It's a little bit of a weird iteration of this idea, but that's what the Gemara says. That brings us to the top of Yuram and Beis. Let's continue.
I mean, when any kind of Chacham, person has a right to take that approach. But you're proving that you're not interested in it.
Here's what you're interested in.
Doesn't it what?
Here's what you're interested in.
That's how it works by Takanas Chacham. When the Chacham do something to benefit you, basically you say no thank you. That's probably what this means.
I didn't look into it. It just struck me as weird. I don't know.
It is, because you're right. It's a come. They said Dawud Amos. It is strange, but that's the point, is that there's an exception, so to speak, which I wonder if that's what's happening.
Rashi says at the bottom, Lo niskavein liknos b'toras takanas chachamim, kasavur. Do you have kasavur?
Yeah.
I can't, the print here is poor. Kasavur shenifilaso yafelo.
That's not what she says, you're right.
It seems like he's wrong, but it's his mindset. Rob, what were you saying?
He said he can do it when they want, they can do it when they want to.
Meaning the rule of Dalet Amos Konos L'B'chol Makom, that your Dalet Amos around you work, that to make you an owner of items works, unless you don't want it to. Which is weird.
Not that a jump on, but yours. It is good.
So I'm not sure I understood the question. So like normally in my Dalet Amos, we assume that anything in my Dalet Amos is mine. But I prefer to jump on the item. It's like, there's a loose football, right? So I prefer to jump on the item. I'm ignoring the Kanas Chachamim. I'm jumping on it to close the deal. That's what the Gemara says over here. Very interesting. Rav Papa says no. Rav Papa Amar Kitakinu le Rabbanan Arba Amos. That's be'alma. In general, that's true. But bisada de bala bayis lo takinu le Rabbanan. You can't claim the Dalet Amos routine when you're in someone else's property. There's a limit to the Chachamim's rule of Dalet Amos Konos L'B'chol Makom. So beside the bayis lo takinu le Rabbanan. Be'afal gav de zachal le Rachmana begava. And even though, yes, when it comes to shikha and peya and all those things in that person's property, I do have access to something in your property. But the Torah only gave you access, only gave me as an ani access to another person's field to walk through it. But the Torah did not give the latitude to me of Dalet Amos. So the reason why I'm jumping here isn't because I'm not interested in the Dalet Amos. It's because it doesn't apply here. The Dalet Amos of mine that make me acquire a property is because the Chachamim didn't want us to fight. It's a din derab. It's a takana derabanan. That takana derabanan has limits, and it doesn't apply in private property. If you're in my backyard and there's a Metzia there, you can't say Dalet Amos is mine. That's not your property. You have absolutely no right to do that. Zero. Totally different response. All right. Now we had started out the din with Arba Amos Konoslo. We said we had one question from Peah and one question from Nezikin. Here's question number 2. Yuramid Beis, 5 lines down. Amarava Mosiv Rav Yaakov Bar Idi Nezikin. Let's take a look at this other case that asks on Arba Amos. This is in fact our Mishnah that we started with today. That's why the Gemara flows the way that it does. He sees an item that he wants, he sees a lost item that he wants to acquire, and he jumps on it. So I'm Reuven, I jump on the item. You're Shimon, you grab it out from under me. Quick hands. Adorable that you jumped on it, but sorry, I'm faster than you, and I win. Basically, whoever ends up with the item wins. That's what it looks like. According to this approach of Nezikin, it's really not Nezikin in a classical way. It's more about a Metzia. So there, Niknule Arba Amos Didei. What's with all the jumping? We should just say, same like we would say before against in the case of Peah. Why over here in the case of Metzia would we not say that he just owns it within his Dalet Amos? Here too, we were trying this Havamina that perhaps the Dalet Amos has an extra requirement of Akni, of saying that it's mine. And it says the Gemara, that's not possible because v'itakun Rabbanon kilo amar mehave. The takana de Rabbanon was only about Arba Amos. It wasn't about Arba Amos plus Akni. You're making stuff up. So it says the Gemara, Kevan denof alale gabli daite the benefilo nichale denikni Arba Amos lo nichale denikni. So here too, answer number one in this sugya is in the sugya of Nezikin, in the sugya of Metzia. We first asked from Peah, now we're asking from Metzia. So over here, same flow of questions in the second Mari Makom about Metzia. And we say, no, it's clear that when you jumped on it, you didn't want to utilize the Takanas Chachamim. That's Pasha, obviously. Otherwise, why would you jump on it? You could just walk by and say, like, that's mine, or even not say anything, it's just yours. It's just yours. Rav Sheshes, however, gives another answer, and this is one that's quoted in the Rambam, and L'chora also quoted in Shulchan Aruch like this. Rav Sheshes Amar, Ki taginu Rabbanon besimta. When do we have a din derabbanon? This goes a little bit to what text was saying earlier. What if there's multiple people around and with overlapping Dalet Amos? Ki taginu Rabbanon besimta. When do we have a rule of Dalet Amos? That's in like alleyways, in unpopulated spaces where there isn't a lot of concentration of people. Delo dachke rabbim. There aren't a lot of people. We would never say this in Times Square. You would say this in Omaha. You'd say this in smaller places. You'd say it in alleyways and in places that don't apply. So maybe, perhaps in the case of the Metzia, why was the guy diving? Because the din of Dalet Amos only applies in a simta. It only applies in unpopulated spaces. This guy found a lost item in Times Square. It was a $100 bill. Oh, he leapt off the bleachers. This guy is like ready to go because he knows that the Dalet Amos rule doesn't apply here. Says the Gemara, wait 1 second. If you look back at the beginning of our Gemara, where Rav Ashi was quoting in the name of Abba Kohen Bardula about Arba Amos, it says B'chol Makom. So our Gemara says, hey, wait 1 second. We're a quarter of the way down on Yudam and Beis. V'ha B'chol Makom Ka'amar. When we learn the rule that there's an Arba Amos as Konoslo, the next words were B'chol Makom. So you just tried, Rav Sheshes, to limit the rule of Arba Amos Konoslo B'chol Makom to a simta. Alleyways, to unpopulated spaces, but that it shouldn't apply l'chora and rishus harabim. But then, how does that fit with the words b'chol makom? Says the Gemara, kol makom la'asuye. That must be that it's coming to teach us something, but it's not what we thought. What it's coming to teach us is la'asuye tzidei rishus harabim. Good. End of sugya here. So what the Gemara means to say is as follows. According to Rav Sheshes, there are 3 spaces. The classic space where Arba Amos or Konoslo is in a simta, in an unpopulated space like an alleyway, like a parking lot, places where there aren't a lot of people. On the other side of the spectrum, where it's Devarim Pshutim, where there isn't an application of Arba Amos Konoslo B'chol Makom, is Times Square, Rishus Harabim, Devon, McCormick. Well, McCormick's a bad example. Walking spaces where there's a lot. Huh? Careful. I know. We don't really have a halachic Rishus Harabim here, but Times Square. Even that's Bechlal L'Shayla. Some poskim write that in Manhattan, doesn't require an Eruv because it's an island, and the slope, the poskim discuss this in Maseches Shabbos. If the slope is, it's 10 and 4. I can't remember which one was the length and which one was the hypotenuse. Anyways, whatever the slope is, if there's a specific angle, if the slope is enough, then you don't even need an Eruv. So provided that there isn't a concentration of 600,000 people within a 12 mil by 12 mil block, then you don't even need an Eruv in Manhattan. And a lot of the Hasidic Rabbanim would walk around holding their talis bags over their head on Shabbos, saying, we don't need an Eruv. The Litvaks were like they couldn't hold anything because they held was users. That's what they were stuck. The big machlokos in the early years of the Eruv generation in the 80s and the 90s. That was when we got one here that was built together with Rabbi Cohen, Rabbi Matenki, and all the other things that went on. Then Skokie had one that we connected them, all the politics. Okay, anyways, so whatever the case is, that's bucket number 2. So bucket number 1, there is a rule of Arba Amos Konoslo in a simta in an alley. There's no application of Arba Amos in the public. What does Kol Makom come to teach us? It comes to teach us about Sidei Rishus Harabim. Okay, so Times Square is very populated, but on 37th Street, which is Tzidei Rishus Harabim, that's fine. There you have Dalet Amos, Konoslo B'chol Makom. And because we quoted this person once, we're going to quote him again. We are a third of the way down, and a little bit of, it's connected, but not directly, a similar sugya. V'amar Reish Lakish mishum Abba Kohen Bardala, Ketana ein la chatzer ve'ein la arba amos. A young girl who's married, who's a ketana, she doesn't have a din of chatzer as it relates to get. And she doesn't have dalet amos as it relates to a din of get. That's a big problem. How does she get divorced? It's only possible through yad. What? Yeah, father married her. Yeah, but the only way to get divorced is v'nasan biyada. That's the pasuk in Sefer Dvarim by divorce. You have to hand her the get. You can't use the same approaches, the same formats of divorce that would apply to an adult, according to this shita, because you can't use chatzar, you can't throw it in her backyard, you can't throw it to her dalet amos. Says the Gemara, that's the shita of Kohen Bardla. However, Rav Yochanan, Mishum Rav Yanai Amar, Yesh la chatzar v'yesh la arba amos. What are you talking about? Why wouldn't it work for a ketana? So says the Gemara, what are Reish Lakish and Rav Yochanan arguing about? Reish Lakish says there is no chatzar, no dalet amos. Rav Yochanan says there is chatzar, there is dalet amos for a ketana. Mar savar chatzar mishum yada israbai. A chatzar is learned from the world of yad. And just like the world of yad applies to a ketana, so too does the world of chatzar. This is the shita of Rav Yochanan. This is all Rav Yochanan. Chatzar and yad are one and the same. And therefore, because if we were to give a ketana a get biyada, she'd be divorced. So too in a chatzar, because chatzar and yad are congruent. They're equals. However, Reish Lakish is a little different. Umar savar chatzar mishum shlichus yisraboy. V'kihechi de shlichus lesla. Chatzar nami lesla because she's a ketana. She has no shlichus. So the question is, where do we learn chatzar from? Do we learn chatzar from yad, in which case, because she has a yad, she has a chatzar? Or do we learn chatzar from shlichus, and because she's a ketana, she has no shlichus, and therefore, if chatzar is learned from shlichus, she has no chatzar also? It says the Gemara, wait 1 second, halfway down on the Amud. Who says that shlichus is from chatzar? After all, Tanya, the pasuk says biyado, it's placed in his hand, ein li ela yado. Gago chatzer v'karfifo minayin. Talmud lomar himotzei simotzei mikol makom. What do we see over here? That it's about yodo. It's about yad. It's not about anything else. If you want to say that a chatzer is learned from shlichus, then we have a problem. What's the problem? Because then I could do something with your chatzer that is usher. I could make you do something usher by putting something in your yard. I could take something stolen and give it to you without you even knowing what's going on. Just drop it in your chatzar, and that can't be because v'kai malan ein shliach l'dvar avera. And here we're going to see 2 answers to this question about whether or not it's possible that chatzar is learned from shlichus. And here's answer number 1, 2/3 of the way down. Ravina, Amar Ravina, heicha amrina de ein shliach l'dvar avera. Where do we say that there is no shlichus for dvar avera? That's heicha de shliach bar chiyuvahu. That's only true with a person, where the human being is a bar chiyuva. You can't say to me, Phil, please steal an item. I mean, you could say it to me, but ein shliach l'dvar avera. And if I do it, I am culpable, not you. However, aval b'chater de la bar chiyuvahu mechayev sholcho. There, if you put it in my yard, I'm not chayev. You're chayev. You're the one who put the stolen item in my yard. The fact that the kinyan took place in my yard is not my fault. I wasn't privy to it. I didn't want it to happen. You're a Russia. You're the one who's on the hook. Elamayata says the Gemara, if that's true, ha'omer le'isha ve'eved, if a person says to a woman or to an eved, tzu'u ganvuli, go out and steal for me, they're not chiyuvim because they're meshubad. An isha whose money is part of her, that goes to her husband, she's meshubah to her husband. And an eved pasha is meshubah to her husband. If a master says to one of them, go steal for me, they're not b'nei chiyuva. Hachanami demechayev sholcha. No, we would say that the ganav is chayev on the theft. We wouldn't say that the baal is chayev on the theft. So what kind of rule is this? So Amr says the Gemara, isha ve'eved, they are b'nei chiyuva nenu. They're not allowed to steal because you ask them to. We wouldn't say in that case that they're not b'nei chiyuva. They are. They just have no money under the current circumstances. But if ever there is a time that they have money, then guess what? They'd be held accountable. Where do we see this? Ditnan. We have an express Mishnah in Maseches Bava Kama that we learned already. I'm sure we all remember it freshly. It wasn't that long ago. I don't. I'm just hoping you do. It says the Gemara, Nisgarsha Isha, Nishtachrer Ha'eved, Chayavin L'Shalem. If they steal while they are under the servitude of another, you're right that in the moment they don't have to pay. But when they're out of their limited circumstance, they do have to pay, which shows us that they are b'nei chiyuv. So that's all answer number 1, that Ein shliach ledvar avera only applies where the shliach is a bar chiyuva. Here's answer number 2, 12 lines from the bottom. Rav Sama Amar, Heicha amrinan ein shliach ledvar avera. When do we say that there's no shliach ledvar avera? That's Heicha di'ibai avid, v'ibai lo avid. That if he wants to do it, he can do it, and if he doesn't want to do it, he doesn't. He can choose not to. Aval chater de bal korche, then mosiv ba mechayev sholcha. But when it comes to a chatzar where there is no option, you don't have to talk to a chatzar. I can just drop the item in your chatzar. Under those circumstances, then the owner is going to be mechayev. So therefore, the Gemara says, "My beinayu." What is the difference between Ravina's answer, where ein shleach l'dvar advera doesn't apply with the shleach bar chiyuva, and Rav Sama's answer, where ein shleach l'dvar advera applies where you have a choice in the matter? Says the Gemara, the difference is Ika beinayu Kohen. The Amar Leili Yisrael. A Kohen says to a Yisrael, a Kohen who's not allowed to marry a grusha, he says to a Yisrael, Tzei v'kadesh li isha grusha. Inami, ish, de Amar lo li isha, akfi li katan. Or if a man says to a woman, shave my child's head. We learned about this sugya, I think in Maseches Nazir, that a woman has no isser of shaving her own head, and therefore they have no isser of shaving a child's pes. To be makif es harosh, no isser for a woman to do that. So in these cases, the person in the middle who's been asked to do work, the Yisrael in the case of the grusha, or the Kohen asked the Yisrael to marry him to a grusha, or a man who says to a woman, shave my kid's head with a razor down to the scalp, including the payas. This person can choose. Don't do it. You can choose. Therefore, and that's not going to be on the sender. That's going to be on you. You had a choice. She could have chosen to not shave the kid's head, and the Yisrael could have chosen to not bring about a case scenario where he marries a grusha to a Kohen. But if you want to say it's not about the choice of the person in the middle, but rather the halachic status of the person in the middle, then then even in these cases, that would be the nafkamina. Even in these cases, if a Kohen says to a Yisrael, marry me to a grusha, because he has no chiyuv, if he does in fact marry the Kohen to a grusha, the Yisrael is not the one who's culpable, because he's not a bar chiyuv on the Isser. Fascinating. What about lifnei iver? Not mentioned in the Gemara, asking on my own. Why doesn't the Gemara say that you're leading someone astray? You're leading will you marry Kohen so-and-so? And she says, yes, that only happened because I, as a Yisrael, betrothed this woman. And she accepts the Kiddushin. I don't know why the Gemara, maybe the Rishonim talk about it, but it should be lifnei iver. But the culpability on the Isser of Grusha does not fall on the Yisrael who is a Shadchan.
Is it chal?
It's chal. It's Usser, but it's...
Points out, just said,
Oh.
makes it proportionate that, yeah, there's obviously lifnei iver here, but it's not in the etzem.
Right, meaning it's a side, it's agav. Okay.
My question is for.
Where do you see that in the Tosfos? Oh, the last Tosfos. Oh, I was looking at the second to last Tosfos. Who I didn't have a matzah name or akvili gadol ela shagadol. Vavkav demuki lahasam kinikab mesayeh ale bahade hanim the inan acher lo laki dahavale. I don't even see what you're saying. An akvili katan?
Oh, really? So, I'm sorry, second to last, sorry.
Oh, okay.
I didn't see the last one.
I didn't see it either. That was a okay. Then I'll look at it later. I don't take it more time. Sorry, your question, Tech. Somebody who's
So what is it a two-stage Isser for the Kohen? Is it for the marriage and then also for the act?
for Bia?
Yeah.
Rashi says the Isser begins immediately. I just have to see what's. Umishas kedushin or mishum loyikachim.
Yeah, but then the question is it two lavin or just one?
The Isser's on the marriage, but yeah.
It's a good question. Loyikachu is the Isser, and it continues.
But the Kedushin is Chal, so there's no Isser in the Bia as it relates to the marriage, because you're married.
Yeah, but it's znus.
It's not Znus.
If she's a grusha.
It's not Znus. It's Znus is it's an
not.
Isser. You're not allowed to be married to the person, but you're married. You are married. It's not like a zona.
Kedushin, oh,
Right. The Kedushin is Tofsin, but it's Usr.
It's also the Kedushin in the first person, but then after that, it's.
You're living Be'isr. You
I
are.
think the meter continues to run.
I'm sure. What are the units of measure? Is it every day, every month, every Tashma Shemitah? I don't know. But that's a good question. Great question. Don't know. Okay, so that would be the nafkamina between the sheet of Ravina that Ein Shlech Devar Avera is dependent on your status versus Rav Sama, who says that it's a question of your ability to choose or not to do that action. And 3 lines from the bottom. How can you say that anyone would hold that chatzar is not because of yad? The pasuk says yada in regards to divorce. Ein li yada gaga chatzer v'karfi faminat. How do we know that in these locations, if a get is put, there shall be divorce? Talmud Omer v'nasan mikol makom. So what do we see over here? That it's literally yada, yad, and chatzir are learned from the same exact place. How in the world could you possibly learn otherwise? It has to be that chatzir is learned from yad. Says the Gemara, le'inyan get kulei amalo plagi de chatzir mishum yadei sarbai. And nobody argues by get. Everyone agrees that when it comes to get, because the pasuk in Chumash says v'nasan biyada, leisman de palig. Everyone agrees that when it comes to divorce, that the din is that chatzir is learned from yad, and therefore by a ketana, we would always say that a chatzir works. Kipligi, where do Reish Lakish and Rav Yochanan argue, like we saw in the middle of the page? Le'inyan Metzia, only by a lost item. Mar Savar, turning to the top of Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, Yelfin and Metzia meet get. One shita says that we learn Metzia from the world of get. Umar Savar lo Yelfin and Metzia mi get. If you learn Metzia from get, then that means it's the same din of yad. If you learn Metzia, if you don't learn Metzia from get, then we wouldn't say that it's a din of yad. That would be the difference between Rish Lakish and Rav Yochanan. By saying a bektana de kuli alma lo pligi, the Yelfin and Metzia mi get. Maybe in regards to a ketana, nobody argues that we learn Metzia from get. But hacha bekatan come if we were dealing with a boy instead of a girl. Mar Savar Yelfin and kata miktanu. Mar Savar lo Yelfin and kata miktana. And then the last answer is v'ibais ema mar amar chada umar amar chada v'lo pligi. They're all dealing with different topics. The Gemara is not clear what that means. Rashi tells us what the difference is. Rashi 5-6 lines down. Dibra maskal mar amar chada. Rav Shimon ben Lakish amar le'inyan Metzia. Rabbi Yochanan le'inyan get. They're talking about different sugyas altogether. And therefore it's just unclear. Like that we were presented that Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan were arguing in the middle of the page on Yudam and Beis, Lav Dafka. Maybe one was talking about Metzia, one was talking about get. We don't know. A little bit of a lack of clarity because they weren't in the same. I mean, they were alive at the same time, but they weren't talking to each other. So we might have been pasted together what we thought was a machlokas, but really they might not have been even at the same party. We have no idea. Next, Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, 8 lines down, 7 lines down, and a new Mishnah. Ra'a osan ratzin achar hametzia. People are running after a lost item. Achar tzvi shavur, after a deer that is injured. Achar gozlo shalor porchu. Birds that don't fly, they're easy to catch. Va'amar zach sali sadi, and they're in my field, and I say the phrase zach sali sadi, zach salo. Then they're mine. That's only if these are the slow-moving, easy-to-catch animals. However, Hayatzvi rat kedarko, a deer is whatever the word is for their running. There's a word for it. They're running. O shayu gozlos mafrichen, birds that fly. V'amar zach sali sadi, and there if you say my field is going to be zoche, lo amar klum. So seemingly, if the animal is a little infirm, they're injured, they're handicapped, they're slow-moving, they're easy to catch, zach sali sadi. It kind of reminds me of the halachos of tzad on Shabbos. You know, if they're easy to catch, then it's not tzad. If they're not easy to catch, then it is tzad. That's what the Gemara says in Beitzah, that if you can catch an animal b'chad shachya, to grab a fish out of a fish bowl is not tzad. He's already trapped. Reach in, grab, done. That's not tzad. Mutter. However, to go fishing would be tzad because it's much more complicated. You got one fish in a large sea. That's for sure not the case. All right. Amar Rav Yehuda Mar Shmuel, who she'omed b'tzad sadehu. This is where the Gemara is going to start to get a little bit more technical, but the Gemara says over here, when is it that I can say zach sali sadi and acquire those handicapped, slow-moving animals? That's only if I'm standing next to my animal. V'tikni le sadehu. Damar Rabbi Yossi Reb Chanina chatzer shel adam konelo shelo midaito. I don't understand. Why do you have to say anything? Why do you have to be anywhere? It's your yard. It's your backyard. If there's a tzvi shavur, you have a tzvi that's in your backyard, its leg broke. You're going to sell it to a guy for parts. You can't eat it because the animal's l'chora a treifa, most likely a treifa. So fine, let the animal die, sell it to the neighbor who's a guy. You're the beneficiary, no problem. Why do you have to do anything? It's in your yard. Why do I have to be there physically? Says the Gemara, Hani mili b'chatzer amishtameres. That would be true in a chatzer that's mishtamer, in a chatzer that's protected by someone. However, aval chatzer she'ein mishtameres. If we have a case of a chatzer that's not mishtameres, so then I omeid bitzad sadehu in ilolo. If there's a field that doesn't have someone protecting it, then no good. But if we have someone who is protecting it, then good. Umana timra. Where do we have this idea? What is the marimakum? The chatzer she'ein mishtameres omeid bitzad sadehu in ilolo. Where do we have this idea that only if there's someone standing next to the field, does my field do the dirty work for me, and therefore I own this animal, even just by saying the phrase in our Mishnah of zachsali sadi? Titania, complex brisa. Third of the way down, Yud Aleph Amid Aleph. Hayomed be'ir ve'omer yodea ani she'omer sheyesh li b'sada po'alim shachachuhu lo yehei shikha. I am in the city, and my field is in southern Illinois. And I am up in the city in Chicago, and I know that my workers left something behind, and I say, lo yehei shikha. I don't want it to be shikha. Does that work? Yachal lo yehei shikha. Maybe we would say, this isn't shikha. Talmud Omar, it is. V'shachachta omer basadeh, basadeh v'shachachta v'lo ba'ir. You can only say v'shachachta when you're in the field, but not when you're in the city. So says the Gemara, there's a stira minei ubei in this brisa. The Gemara says halfway down in Yud Aleph Amid Aleph, Hagufa Kasha, this is a problem. Amris, one part of the brisa that we just read says Yachol lo yehei shikha. What does that imply? Alma habe shikha. That's what it implies. But then the next line was a little bit different. And then v'nasivla, and then we quoted a brisa, we quoted a limud in the pasuk v'nasivla Gemara. We brought a tradition that it says B'sadeh v'shachachta v'lo be'ir Alma lo have shikha. This is the right way to understand this complex brisa that we just saw. If you're in the field and you forget something, it's definitely shikha. If you remembered and then you forgot, ain't shikha, that's not considered shikha. My taima, what's the reason this is true? And this is the key part for us. Since you're near your field, it's like your chatzar, which is really a chatzar mishtamerish v'zach saleh. So when you're close to your field, you can be zoche. Aval be'ir, if my field is down south and I'm up in the big city, afilu zachor l'v'sav shachuach havya shikha. My taima delese gabein deliz kile. So this brisa, in its reinterpretation, teaches us a principle, one that we saw earlier. And the principle that we learned is that if it is a chatzar hamishtameres and I'm close by, so then I can say that it's not shikha. But if I'm not close by, then I have no latitude to do so. So says the Gemara, Mimai, how do you know that this limud is correct? Dilma gzeros hakasuv. Maybe it's just a stam gzeros hakasuv. How so? Maybe the gzeros hakasuv is the besade nehave shikha, that in the field, if you're near the field, then it would be shikha. Uve'ir lo nehave shikha, and in a city it would not, because Amar Kra lo sashuv lekachto lerabos shikchas ha'ir. That it's saying that that's gzeros hakasuv, that it's lerabos shikchas ha'ir, that if you forget something and you're in the city, that it doesn't count. Says the Gemara, you can't say that it's gzeros hakasuv because that pasuk is already used for something else. Haimi baile lelab. That teaches us the fundamental lav that you're not allowed to go back and collect shikha. Once something is begeder shikha, you have an iser deoraisa as the bailim to go back and take it. You're taking from an ani. That's the din of shikha and chumash. You're not allowed to take that from an ani. That's not allowed. So says the Gemara, in Cain, if that's true, that you want to say that we need the pasuk for a lav, nemakra lo sikachenu. That's what the pasuk should have said. My lo sashuv the rabbo shikha seir, to teach us two things instead of one. The Gemara asks, okay, but ve'akati, and still mi boile lechedetnan. We still need that pasuk for the following Mishnah. This Mishnah is found in Maseches Peah. Shelafanav ein shikha. If there's items in front of you, physically in front of you, then there's no shikha on those items. Shela'achara, but once you pass by them and they're not behind you, yesh shikha shehi beval tashuv. That's where the Isser kicks in. And the Brisa continues, the Mishnah, I should say, from Peah continues, 8 lines from the bottom, Ze'aklal. Kol shehu beval tashuv shikha, kol she'enu beval tashuv eno shikha. So what do we see? That the pasuk is still needed for something. So says the Gemara, Amar Avashi, Amar Kra, Yihye, Lerabos Shikras Ha'ir. What this is coming to teach us is that we do still have our our baseline Mari Makom, which we were trying to prove for the last 20 lines, that the only time a person is able to say lo shikha, that it's not shikha, is if I'm standing near the field, but shikha sa'ir does not work. Now we've proven ourselves, again, in a very complex brisa, but that's what the brisa reads. So that is the fundamental din that we've learned so far, and that is that in our Mishnah, on the top of Yud Aleph Amud Aleph, in the first half of our Mishnah, when he's able to say zachsalo and it actually zachsali sadi and it actually works, that's only if he's standing nearby, but if he's far away, it does not work. Wait 1 second. I have a case scenario where Rabban Gamliel was very far from where he was, and he was able to bring about some serious halachic changes. And he wasn't near the field that he was talking about, which is a kasha on the presentation of the Gemara at the top of this page. Our Gemara opened on the 10th line here, which said, Amar Rabbi Yehuda Mar Shmuel v'husha omed al b'tzad sadeh. We just quoted 2 or 3 more Amoraim that seemed to agree, but they all went against the following. Is it a brisa? Yeah, it's a Mishnah on Maseches, Ma'aser Sheni. So it says the Gemara, wait 1 second. How can you say you have to be standing next to the field? Eisve Rabbi Abba Le'ula. We have a brisa. Ma'aser Rabban Gamliel u'zakenim shayu b'ayim b'sfina. Rabban Gamliel and the elders were on a boat. They were traveling. Amar Rabban Gamliel Isur Shani Asi Lamod Nason Yoshua. He realized that back at home there was food that he did not tithe, and he wanted to take care of it. By the Chachamim, they wanted everything tithed at all times. No food was ever left over that wasn't tithed. And he was 1,000 miles from home. He was on a boat. He was on a ship. He was on a yacht, and he wanted to get this done properly. So what did he do? He said, down the road, I'm going to be doing some medida. I'm going to measure out my my meiser. I'm giving it to Yoshua. Shalom al Yisrael. Problem solved from 1,000 miles away. But remember the rule that we just started with, that you can only make these decisions when you're near your field. He was nowhere near his field. So that's going to be problem number 1. And then on the top of the next page, we finish off this idea by Yehoshua, and he adds in these words, Umekomo muskarlo, the place where the meiser sits that I want to give to Yehoshua, I'm hereby, says Rabban Gamliel, renting out the space to him, no problem at all. And then that's part number 1 of the Mishnah for Meiser Sheni. And on the top of Yud Aleph Amud Beis, and we're going to head Emir Hashem to the top of Yud Beis Amud Aleph, the Isur Acher Shani Asi Lamod Nosin Akiva Ben Yosef Kadesh Nizkebo La'anim Umakomo Muskarlo. Here too, he said, Rabbi Gamliel said, I'm also giving over a little bit of the goods to Akiva Ben Yosef. That's the famed Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva was very good about poor people, and he would take care of them. So says the Gemara, B'chi Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Akiva, B'tzad Tzadel Shel Rabban Gamliel Hayomden. A little tongue in cheek, a little bit of like snarky. The Gemara is like, well, you think they were standing there? They were not standing there. They were on the boat. That's what it says. They were on the boat. So you just told me for a whole Amud with a super complicated brisa, no, they got to be standing there to make the decisions. No, they don't. Because the Mishnah in Meiser Sheni says that all these great Gedolim were sitting on the boat, and all these decisions were made from afar. So the Gemara says, Amar Le, 5 lines down, Dami, it appears to me that Haime Rabbanan, that one of these rabbis was Kidelo Gamri Inshish Maisa. Seems like somebody wasn't paying attention in shiur. That's what the Gemara says. This question was posed, if you look at the bottom, 3 lines from the bottom, from Rabbi Abba to Ula. It's going to come up important in a minute. So Ula says back to Rabbi Abba, I'm not sure you were paying attention in shiur yesterday. That's basically what this line means. It says the Gemara, Ki asala surah, when they got to surah, Amar lahu, he said to them, namely, Ula said to everybody, somebody said to him, Rabbi Abba says, Hachi Amar Ula, Hachi Osvise. They had this dialogue, and they were trying to figure out what was Ula bothered by that he thought this wasn't a good argument. I mean, look, we're no people to assess, but at the very least, it's clear that Rabban Gamliel and these other greats were on a boat, and it's clear that they made transactions from afar. And that seems to be against what Rabbi Yehuda Mar Shmuel said at the beginning of our Gemara on the top of Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. It says the Gemara, Amar Le, Ahume Rabbanan, Rabban Gamliel metaltele agav mikarkoi hikna lehem. Okay, we need about 6 weeks to unpack this line, which basically means that there's something called a kinyan agav. It's a unique type of kinyan that because you're making kinyan number 1, you can also piggyback and make kinyan number 2. That's the short version of this. Reb Zera Kibla, Reb Zera understood that that's why Ula didn't like what Rabbi Abba brought from the Meiser Sheni case. Don't bring me the case of Rabban Gamliel, he was talking about a Kinyan Agav. We're not talking about a Kinyan Agav. Apples and oranges, simple answer. But Rabbi Abba lo kibla. Rabbi Abba says, I totally disagree with you. And Rava chimes in now. Amar Rava shapir avi de lo kibla. Rabbi Abba did good by not saying, by not accepting what they thought was the difference between our case and the case of Rabban Gamliel. Because Rava says, and to support Rabbi Abba, that Rabbi Abba's question was excellent. He says a third of the way down, quarter of the way down, just go, you just go like this. Here, just do something. What is this whole thing? Isor that I'm going to be lamod, I'm going to give to Yoshua, I'm going to give a little bit more. What? Just go do a Kinyan Sudar like everybody else. Why didn't you do that? Ella, it must be that you couldn't do a Kinyan Chalipin. Why couldn't you do a Kinyan Chalipin? Because like the Gemara, Ella Tovas Hana, Eino Mamon, Liknos Mimenu Bechalipin. It must be that we're talking about Tovas Hana. What's Tovas Hana? We've learned before. Tovas Hana is not a monetary transaction. It's that I get to choose who gets my Meiser. That's Tovas Hana. What was our the Mishnah we brought from Meiser Sheni at the bottom of the previous summer with Rabban Gamliel? What was happening? Rabban Gamliel gave some of his Meiser to Yoshua, and he gave some of the other. That's Tovas Hana. And by Tovas Hana, you cannot do Chalipin. So says the Gemara, Hachanami Tovas Hana, Einamamon Liknos Al Gabe Karka. That's why in this case, we weren't dealing with that. We're dealing with Tovas Hana. So he thought the question was actually a valid question that Rabbi Abba was asking. It can't be the Agav Karka, because we're not dealing with Agav Karka. We're dealing with a case of Tovas Hana. Says the Gemara, let's see what we're talking about over here. Here's answer number one, Vilohi. I disagree. And the Gemara gives two responses. Matnos kahuna nesina ksiva behu. When it comes to the matnos kahuna and meiser included, all of that is already written about. Chalipin derech mekach umemkarhu metaltalin agav mekarka nesina alimtahi. That when it comes to chalipin, you're right, that applies to mekach umemkar. By the Tovas Hana, we can't do that. However, by the metaltalin, if we're talking about metaltalin, once you're dealing with a transaction of metaltalin, then agav karka nesina alimtahi. Then Agav Karka, the Kinyan of Agav Karka is a perfectly fine and even very strong alimta. It's very strong, and therefore we could even say against Rabbi Abba and like Reb Zera that the case from Meiser Sheni with Rabban Gamliel is talking about a Kinyan Agav Karka, problem solved. Therefore, you can't ask from the case of Meiser Sheni. Answer number two, Rav Papa Amar, Das Acheres Makne Osa Shaini. That when there are other people involved in the transaction, that is no longer a regular transaction. And on the boat with Rabban Gamliel was Yehoshua and was Rabbi Akiva. So because they were there, the transactions that happened had multiple people involved, and that's different than a transaction without multiple people involved. So says the Gemara, Uminat Timra, halfway down on Yud Aleph Amud Beis. Sorry about the 9:30. If you were trying to make it, I apologize. Says the Gemara, how do we know that this idea of Das Acheres Makne works? Says the Gemara Ditnan. We have a Mishnah. Ra Osan Ratzin Achara Metzia. That was what we saw in our Mishnah on Yud Aleph Amud Aleph. You have to run after them and catch them yourself. How would this be different if we weren't talking about one person chasing an animal, but rather me giving a matana to another person? Namely, it's not a one-person interaction, it's a two-person interaction. That's where we have das acheres. What if there's two people? So kibla minei Rabbi Abba bar Kahana afal pi sheratz acheren ve'ein magin. There still would be a kinyan. My timer, lab mishum de das acheres makno sunshiny. When we're dealing with two people, so then I don't even have to catch up to the item. When you're running one person after the item, you want to keep it, you got to get to it. But if it's das acheres makne, I want to give it to somebody else. I don't even have to catch up to the animal, and I can still do the matana. We therefore see that das acheres is makne, and perhaps the case from Meiser Sheni with Rabban Gamliel and Yoshua and Rabbi Akiva was the case of das acheres makne. Amar le Rav Simi the Rav Papa. I wait 1 second. Hare get to das acheres makne osa. There's two people involved in a get. You have a husband and a wife, or a husband and a divorcing husband and a divorcing wife. The Amar Ula who shomedes b'tzad beiso b'tzad chatzera. Oh, there we don't say das acheres makne. There we see that you need to be close to the field, and das acheres doesn't work. That was the whole taich. We wanted to say that by Rabban Gamliel. Das acheres means that you can do it from afar. There's multiple people involved. You don't have to be omeid b'tzido shel asada, which was exactly what we were trying to answer, because that was what Rabbi Yehuda Mar Shmuel said at the beginning of our Gemara. So the Gemara says, stop talking about get. Get is so mechudash, you can almost never ask a kasha from get. Oh, Kimat, how many times have we seen this? Shiny get because of X, shiny get because of Y. We're seeing it again. 5 lines from the bottom. Shiny get. Isay bal korcha. So it's completely not comparable here to apples and oranges. You're totally dealing with a world of halacha that is exceptionally unique. And therefore, you cannot ask about das makna not applying to get because get has very unique halachos. Maski flor of sheshes braid rav idi v'lav kal v'chomeru. Isn't this something we could have learned out from a kal v'chomer? Uma get to isay bal korche. Just like by a get that we know can be forced upon a woman. I omedes betzad beisa uvetzad chatzera in ilolo. And if she's present, she's divorced. And if she's not, then matana demidaite lo kol shekain. All the more so when it comes to a matana that is midaite, we should say so all the more so. So don't tell me that das acheres makne doesn't apply to get. That's not true. Elo Amar Rav Ashi, turning to the top of Yud Beis Amud Aleph, just a couple lines to go. We'll stop on the 4th line. Chatzer israboi mishum yad. When it comes to chatzer, as it relates to an isha, that's learned out from yad. Velo gara mishlichus, and certainly not worse than shlichus. Gabe get dechovula. When it comes to a get, which is to the detriment of a woman, now she's alone. Ein chavin la'adam ela b'fanav. You guys are taking all these halachic terminologies of das acheres makna. Stop. This falls back on a very basic principle. When you're doing something negative to someone, they have to be present. If it's going to be gabe get chovula, ein chavin la'adam ela b'fanav. But gabe matana deschus lo zachin la'adam shelo b'fanav. And therefore, the distinction between get and the case of Metzia is that get is a chov and a Metzia is a schus. Therefore, by the get, you need her to be present. But by a therefore, by a get, you need her to be present because it's a chov. By the Metzia, since it's a schus, they don't need to be present. You can be makna from a distance. We'll stop right here. In Yirtzeh Hashem, tomorrow we'll pick up with the appropriate daf for the first time in 12 blot. Baruch Hashem. Wishing you all a beautiful night.